It's after midnight at Graceland. The house is busy in that strange, half-awake way it had in the mid-70s. Telephones in the kitchen, laughter somewhere down the hall, a TV droning in the jungle room like background weather. Upstairs, Elvis Presley is sitting in the glow of another television. The sound is low. His plate of food is half-touched. He isn't really watching. He's just letting the picture move so the room doesn't feel so still. A quiet knock on the door. It's not one of the boys just dropping in to joke around. It's someone who only comes up when something is wrong. In his hand is a thin stack of papers or a magazine folded back on itself. Elvis' own name bold on the page. "You need to see this," he says. He doesn't walk all the way in. He leaves space as if what he's bringing is contagious. Elvis takes the pages. At first it looks like the usual, his weight, his schedule, gossip about Priscilla Presley and their daughter, the things tabloids chew on when there's nothing new to print. Then the words get more specific. Details about the upstairs routine at Graceland, about pills, about rages and apologies, about checks written and cars given away in the middle of the night. Things only a handful of men could know. He stops reading halfway down the page. The man who could roar from a stage to 20,000 people does nothing at all. No thrown chair, no raised voice, just a long, frozen silence that makes the other man wish he would shout. In that quiet, something that had been cracking for years finally gives way. This was the night Elvis didn't just lose 3 employees. He stopped believing anyone in that house was really on his side. To most people, the story of Elvis Presley ends with one image. A worn-out king, trapped inside Graceland, surrounded by too many people and not enough truth. A man who seemed to have everything, and yet somehow had no one who could really reach him. But people who were there remember something else. They talk about the way he studied faces, how he'd fall silent in the middle of a joke, watching the room the way he once watched a crowd. How, in those last years, he'd test people with small offers, small secrets, just to see what came back to him a week later. On stage, he still called them the guys, the boys. Off stage, he paid for their houses, their cars, their families' medical bills. He kept them close, and they kept him moving from hotel to hotel, from Vega's showroom to airport runway to Graceland and back again. From the outside, it looked like a band of brothers. Inside, almost every person in his life was on his payroll. That's the part the photos don't show. Every laugh around the table, every late-night movie downstairs, every love you man in the hall, all of it floated on contracts, favors, and checks that had to keep clearing. So the question this moment forces us to ask is simple and brutal. At what point did Elvis Presley stop believing those smiles were real? Not the first time a record label cheated him, not the first time a reporter twisted his words, those things he could understand. This is narrower, sharper. What finally convinced him that even inside Graceland, in the one place that was supposed to be home, almost everyone around him had something to gain from keeping him just tired enough, just dependent enough, just grateful enough to never say no. And once that belief snapped, did anything about his life, his music, or his fate ever stand a chance of staying the same? To understand that night upstairs, with those papers in his hand, we have to go back to the boy who still believed family meant something different inside those gates. He didn't start out suspicious. In the beginning, Elvis Aaron Presley was a shy kid from Tupelo who could barely look up when he sang. He knew poverty, he knew loss, he knew what it felt like when people ignored you. So when the world suddenly wanted him, he trusted that. He trusted the screaming girls, the DJs, the men in suits who said son and genius in the same sentence. He trusted the bandmates who rode with him in beat-up cars, laughing their way from one cheap hotel to the next. He trusted that love, once given, stayed given. On those first tours, he'd buy meals for the whole group even when the money wasn't really there. When he finally did have money, it burst out of him in bigger ways. A Cadillac for his mother, clothes for the boys, gifts that said, in his own language, "You're with me, I'm with you." Some remember how he'd press keys into a hand and say, "Here, you drive it. It's yours now," as if generosity alone could cement the walls around his circle. Back then, he believed loyalty could be bought with kindness. And the trouble is, for a while it worked. Graceland didn't arrive as a prison, it arrived as a promise. A big white house on a hill in Memphis where Elvis could bring everyone in from the cold. Family, friends, cousins, musicians, bodyguards, guys who'd known him before the gold records and guys who only knew him once the checks got bigger. He filled it the way a lonely person fills silence. Rooms that might have stayed empty were given over to pool tables, TVs, and the loud, comfortable chaos of people who had nowhere better to be. He didn't want to walk into a quiet house and hear himself think. He wanted noise. He wanted life. He wanted to be surrounded. On paper, most of them were employees. In the kitchen, they were family. They'd wake him when it was time to go to the airport. They'd run interference with fans. They'd sit up watching movies with him at 4 a.m., then go crash in rooms he paid for, on beds he bought, under a roof that existed because he kept standing under stage lights. The line between love and work blurred until no one could say exactly where it was. When everyone in your living room gets paid because you wake up in the morning, "How are you?" stops sounding like a simple question. In that world, Colonel Tom Parker's shadow never left the room. The colonel had taken Elvis from regional phenomenon to global figure. But by the time the Vegas years rolled around, the cost of that success was visible in the schedule pinned to the wall. Show after show, contract after contract, safe deals that brought in guaranteed money but kept Elvis locked into a pattern: hotel, stage, suite, plane, Graceland, repeat. The people close to Elvis noticed how few decisions really felt like his anymore. Touring plans, film choices, TV specials, most of it came to him already shaped. He could push back, but the answer from the colonel's side was almost always the same. "It's the best thing, son, trust me." Meanwhile, the colonel kept his own circle separate. Different phone calls, different rooms, different loyalties. If Elvis ever hesitated, there was always someone nearby to assure him it was for his own good, for his fans, for his image, for his future. The more other people handled things, the more the man whose name was on everything stopped seeing the full picture of his own life. If Elvis ever doubted a decision, there was always someone ready with a reason why he shouldn't. Then came the pills. At first, like so many artists of that era, Elvis Presley used them the way doctors and handlers recommended: to sleep on command, to wake up when he shouldn't have been able to smooth out the violent swings between stage adrenaline and hotel room emptiness. One to bring you down, one to bring you back, one to keep you going long enough to get on the plane. People around him still argue about where helping ended and enabling began. Some insist they were protecting him, doing what any crew would do for a star whose schedule would have broken a healthier man. Others later admitted they were afraid to say no, afraid of losing their spot in the house, their place on the tour, their access to the life that came with being close to Elvis Presley. So the doctors kept coming. Prescriptions were filled. Bottles appeared in suitcases and on bedside tables. And with each new medication, Elvis had to lean more heavily on the same people who controlled access to those bottles. He wasn't just dependent on the drugs, he was dependent on the hands that passed them to him and the voices that told him, "This will help, you need this, just take it, we've got you." Every new pill for Elvis made one thing clear: the weaker he felt, the stronger everyone else's position became. The rumors didn't start with a book. They started with little things that showed up in print before they'd ever been said on a microphone. A detail about how late he stayed up. A story about some meltdown in a hotel suite. A line about the odd behavior at Graceland, that sounded uncomfortably specific. Elvis would see these pieces and ask the room, "How do they know that?" And the room would shrug. Some insisted the press just made things up. Others blamed somebody at the hotel. What almost no one wanted to say out loud was the simplest answer. The only people who could have given those details were in the house with him. He laughed it off, but he also started watching. Who was on the phone more? Who disappeared to talk to a reporter friend? Who seemed to know exactly what was in the papers before he opened them? He didn't explode. He just got a little quieter. And that silence scared some of them more than any outburst. Most people think of Elvis' problems as emotional. But underneath the heartache, there was always maths. Divorce settlements, tax bills, bad business deals, endless touring obligations arranged to keep the machine fed. Elvis was still giving money away like the kid who wanted to make sure everyone stayed with him. Cars, jewelry, help with hospital bills, help with mortgages. He loved giving. He did not love paperwork. So he left a lot of that side of things to managers, accountants, and advisors. Over time, Elvis knew less about his own finances than some of the men working for him did. They could tell you what a tour would gross, what a contract was worth, what a cancellation would cost. He could only tell you how exhausted he was. When the man whose name is on everything understands the least about where the money goes, suspicion stops feeling like paranoia. It starts feeling like self-defense. That's the backdrop when the hardest decision of all comes down. The firing of the bodyguards. Several of the men who had stood between Elvis and the world for years, men who took punches, blocked fans, rode in the front seats of cars, were suddenly told their services were no longer needed. Officially, it was about image and lawsuits and cleaning things up. Accounts differ on how much of this came from management and how much came directly from Elvis, but even sympathetic voices admit he was under heavy pressure to agree. Some remember him saying he didn't want to lose them. Others recall conversations where he seemed to convince himself it would be better for everyone. What's consistent is this: one day, men who had keys to Graceland and access to the upstairs were in. The next day, they were out. Most people think loyalty ends when the paycheck stops. But the reality is more complicated and more dangerous. Not long after, whispers start moving through the Memphis air. The fired bodyguards are talking to a writer. They're planning a book. Not a fan tribute, not a tour diary. A tell-all. A book that, in their view, might wake Elvis up. In the view of almost everyone else, it would expose his private struggles for money. This is where one of the only hard, public anchors of this story appears. In 1977, just weeks before Elvis Presley's death, a book called Elvis, What Happened, hit shelves, written with 3 former members of his security team. On the page were stories of pills and late-night rages, health scares, emotional breakdowns. The same upstairs at Graceland, world he had always kept behind a curtain, was now available for anyone with a few dollars and a curiosity about his worst moments. Some people close to him later said they believed the book might actually save his life by forcing him to confront what was happening. Others felt only the cut of betrayal. Elvis, according to those who saw his reaction, read enough to understand the shape of it. He didn't need to finish the chapter to know who was talking. For a long moment, he said nothing. He didn't ask, how could they? He didn't ask, why? He just went quiet in a way the room had not heard before. That silence, one witness recalled, was like something leaving him. Most people think the real break came when the world read the book. But for Elvis, the real break came earlier, in the private realization that the people who knew him best believed they had to go to the press to get through to him. It told him 2 things at once. They cared enough to make noise. They cared too little to protect his dignity while doing it. He was trapped inside that contradiction. If he raged at them, he'd prove every story about his temper. If he ignored it, he'd prove every story about his denial. Either way, the men who had once formed his shield had now become another kind of weapon pointed toward him. And in that upstairs room, with the pages in his hand, he had to decide what this meant not just about them, but about everyone else still living on his estate, drawing their lives from his signature. That's the moment we come back to. The turning point few saw, but everyone felt the ripples of. Upstairs at Graceland, the TV flickers in the corner, soundless. Elvis holds the pages in one hand. His fork, still resting on the plate, goes untouched. According to some accounts, he asks a single, flat question. Is this what they've been doing? He doesn't say their names. He doesn't swear. He doesn't defend himself. He just asks it once and lets the words hang there. No one in the room rushes to fill the silence. No one says they're lying, even if they want to. No one says they're just worried about you, even if that's partly true. They stand in a kind of frightened stillness, as if any sound might crack something fragile that's still holding. He looks back down. He sees descriptions of his body, his habits, his moods. He reads about nights he cannot even fully remember, preserved now as scenes in someone else's story. He sees things he said, in confidence, turned into lines for strangers to dissect. The house feels smaller, not just because of the walls, but because of the understanding settling over him. There is no such thing as just between us anymore. He folds the pages once, sets them aside. In that small, almost casual movement, a decision is made. The people around him expect an explosion. Instead, he starts giving instructions. Who comes upstairs? Who doesn't? Who gets access to him when he's tired, when he's medicated, when he's trying to rest? Who keeps their job? Who doesn't? On the surface, it looks like a practical boundary. Inside, it's something else. It's the end of a belief he'd carried since the first car rides with the band, that inside his circle, his name was safe. From that night on, Elvis would still perform. He would still laugh, still hand out rings and cars and favors. But every smile in that house, every "we love you," every late-night conversation would pass through a new filter in his mind. What do they get from saying this? What do they lose if I walk away? What will they tell the world about me when I'm not here to answer back? After that night, Elvis would still be surrounded. But he would never again feel truly among his own people. The days after that kind of break don't come with a soundtrack. There are no big announcements. No one gathers in the jungle room and says, things are different now. It shows up in small ways. People who used to walk straight upstairs pause at the bottom of the steps. They wait to be called instead of inviting themselves in. Doors that used to stay open are now closed most of the time. Some remember Elvis Presley spending more time alone in his room, TV on, volume low, drifting in and out of sleep that didn't really feel like rest. He still called for the guys, still asked for late-night sandwiches, still put on movies, still told stories. But the long, wandering confessions, the kind where he'd talk about his fears, his mother, his place in the world, those came less often. He started keeping more of that inside. When you no longer know who will repeat what you say, silence feels safer than honesty. On stage, the audience still saw flashes of the old warmth. The teasing with the band. The scarf around a fan's neck. The grin that could light an arena for a few seconds at a time. But if you watch the later concert footage closely, the Vegas shows, the tour in the mid-70s, you can see something else in certain moments. A tiredness behind the eyes. A man scanning the stage, not just checking the band, but glancing at the men lined along the edges. The ones meant to protect him. The ones who could, if they chose, tell the world anything they wanted about the man behind the microphone. He still gave them introductions, still joked with them into the mic. He just trusted less what any of it meant when the spotlight went dark. Downstairs at Graceland, life kept going. People came and went. New faces appeared in the kitchen where old ones had once sat. Gifts still changed hands. Rings, jackets, money pushed across tables to solve problems that would never touch Elvis' world directly. If anything, the giveaways grew bigger. As if the only way to make himself feel safe was to keep everyone else indebted, to make sure they had more to lose by crossing him than by staying. But that doesn't cure the doubt. It feeds it. Every time he helped someone, the same question followed a few steps behind. Would they still be here if I couldn't do this for them? Reports from those final years talk about a man who could still be incredibly kind, incredibly funny, and then suddenly, in the middle of the night, incredibly distant. Walking through his own house like a guest. Turning away from questions. Changing the channel when a news segment mentioned his name. By the time the world mourned him, Elvis had already spent years grieving something no one could see, the loss of a home he could actually trust. For decades, people have looked at late-period Elvis and seen the same easy story. He let himself go. He couldn't say no. He was surrounded by yes men and couldn't escape. There's truth in some of that. But when you place those years next to this quiet, crushing break in trust, the picture sharpens. The man shuffling through Graceland in those last summers was not just careless. He was wounded. The reluctance to let cameras deep into Graceland. The careful management of who could speak to the press and who couldn't. The way interviews narrowed, avoiding real questions with quick jokes and simple answers. All of that looks different if you remember he'd held a book in his hands that proved the worst thing he could imagine, that his private pain was negotiable and that people who loved him could still sell it. Graceland is a museum now. Fans file past his grave, through the rooms he filled, past the glass cases holding his jumpsuits and guitars. They see the gold and the glitter and the scale of his success. Most will never feel what he felt that night, sitting under the soft light of an upstairs lamp, realizing the only place that was supposed to belong entirely to him had been opened up to strangers without his consent. The night he stopped believing everyone around him didn't just change his trust in a few men. It changed the way he met the entire world, including the millions of us who still speak his name. Maybe the real tragedy isn't just how Elvis Presley died. It's how early he stopped feeling truly alive among the people closest to him. If everyone in your life was paid to stay, how would you ever know who really loved you? When you look at Elvis Presley's final years, the tour, the Vegas shows, the quiet halls of Graceland, who do you think he could still trust at the end, if anyone at all? Let me know in the comments what you believe. Were the men around him trying to save him or simply holding on to the life his name gave them? And if you want more stories that sit in these quiet, uncomfortable moments of Elvis' life, not the posters, but the human being behind them, you can subscribe and stay with me for the next one.